The blood-red sun crept over the horizon as Eliza Dawson curled her trembling body into the corner of the auction block, the hushed whispers of the growing crowd in Timber Creek penetrating her soul like icy daggers in the spring of 1878. Too quiet, this one. "Been 3 weeks and barely a word," muttered the slaver to a potential buyer, his tobacco-stained fingers gesturing dismissively at the young woman whose auburn hair hung limply around her face. "Good worker, though. Strong back, just don't expect conversation." The crowd of men ranchers, miners, and merchants from the surrounding Montana territory assessed her with calculating eyes. At 20 years old, Eliza had been passed from one owner to another since her parents' death from typhoid 4 years earlier. Being orphaned with no relations willing to take her in had left her vulnerable in a world that valued women primarily as workers or wives. Her last employer had sold her contract when her silence became too unnerving for his chattering wife. Standing at the back of the crowd, Isaac Owens pulled his worn leather hat lower over his eyes, his tall frame leaning against a hitching post as he observed the proceedings with growing disgust. At 32, the cattle rancher had seen enough of human cruelty to last several lifetimes. The war between the states had claimed his youth, and the harsh frontier had hardened what remained of his heart, or so he'd believed, until this moment. "$5 for the girl," called out a gruff voice belonging to Hank Miller, the owner of the local saloon, whose reputation for mistreating his employees was well known throughout the territory. Isaac's jaw tightened. He'd come to town for supplies, not to witness human trafficking disguised as labor contracting. Yet something in the woman's posture dignity amidst humiliation stirred something within him. When she finally raised her eyes, meeting his briefly across the dusty street, he saw neither plea nor resignation, merely a quiet acceptance that cut him to the quick. $10, another voice called. "15, countered Miller, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Before Isaac could consider the wisdom of his actions, his voice rang out clear and strong, $100. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned toward him. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. $100 from Mr. Owens. Any other bids? When no further offers came, the auctioneer's gavel fell with finality. Sold to Isaac Owens for $100. As Isaac approached to claim his purchase and sign the necessary paperwork, the slaver chuckled. "Mighty generous price for damaged goods, Owens." "She's pretty enough, but strange as they come, too quiet for most folks' comfort." Isaac's blue eyes hardened as he counted out the money. "Silence ain't a problem if you stay," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Some talk too much without saying anything worthwhile." He turned to Eliza, whose wary eyes tracked his every movement. "Miss, I'm Isaac Owens. I have a ranch 10 miles west of town. I need help with cooking and housekeeping. You'll have your own room, regular meals, and fair treatment." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to." For the first time, a flicker of something besides fear crossed Eliza's face, curiosity, perhaps, or cautious relief. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Isaac untied her bound hands and offered her his coat against the morning chill. "My wagon's this way. We'll get supplies before heading back." As they walked toward his wagon, whispers followed them, but Isaac paid them no mind. He had come to town for grain and ammunition, not a housekeeper and certainly not a woman. Yet something about Eliza's silent dignity had compelled him to act. And now he found himself responsible for another human being, something he had carefully avoided since returning from the war. His ranch, Wild Timber, was a solitary place, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land with a modest but well-built 2-story house he'd constructed with his own hands. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and he employed only 2 hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the corrals. It was a life of hard work and blessed solitude, far from the memories that haunted him. As he helped Eliza into the wagon, he wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if, perhaps, this silent woman might somehow fit into his quiet world. Eliza sat rigidly on the wagon seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. 4 years of being passed from one owner to another had taught her to expect the worst while hoping for mere indifference. Kindness was too dangerous to wish for. It either came with conditions or disappeared when inconvenient. Isaac moved efficiently through the general store, selecting basic supplies: flour, coffee, beans, salt, sugar. He paused by the fabric section, glancing back at Eliza's threadbare dress. "You'll need proper clothes," he said, his voice matter of fact. "Winter comes early in these parts." The shopkeeper's wife approached, eyeing Eliza with undisguised curiosity. "I heard you bought yourself some help, Mr. Owens," she said, her voice sweet with insinuation. "Finally tired of your own cooking, Mrs. Parker?" Isaac nodded politely, ignoring her tone. "Miss Dawson needs appropriate clothing for ranch work. Could you assist her in selecting what she needs?" Eliza tensed at being addressed directly but followed Mrs. Parker to a quieter corner of the store. The woman's hands moved quickly, measuring Eliza with practiced efficiency. "Not much meat on your bones, girl," Mrs. Parker commented, "but pretty enough beneath the dirt. Mr. Owens is a good man, though peculiar since the war, keeps to himself mostly." She lowered her voice. "They say he was a captain in the Union Army, saw terrible things, came west afterward, and hardly speaks to anyone except for business." Eliza absorbed this information silently, filing it away as she did all useful knowledge. A quiet man who valued privacy might be less demanding of conversation. When they returned to Isaac, Mrs. Parker had assembled several practical items: 2 work dresses, a Sunday dress, undergarments, a heavy coat, sturdy boots, and a nightgown. "She'll need all this to start," Mrs. Parker declared, "and some soap and hair ribbons too, I think." Isaac nodded, adding the items to his purchases without comment. As they left the store, he stopped at the barbershop next door. "Wait here," he told Eliza, returning minutes later with a small paper-wrapped package. "Scissors," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "For your hair if you want, and this," he handed her a small book from his coat pocket, "was my mother's. Thought you might like something to read." The unexpected gesture nearly broke Eliza's carefully maintained composure. The book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, represented the first personal gift she'd received since her parents' death. She clutched it tightly, nodding her thanks, unable to meet Isaac's eyes for fear he would see the emotion threatening to overflow. The journey to Wild Timber Ranch took most of the afternoon. Isaac maintained a respectful silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering brief explanations about the territory. Eliza watched the landscape transform from the dusty streets of Timber Creek to rolling grasslands dotted with stands of pine and aspen. Cattle grazed in the distance, and mountains rose majestically against the western sky. "Home," Isaac said simply as they crested a hill revealing a sprawling valley below. A sturdy 2-story house stood near a creek lined with cottonwoods, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone was already there. "My foreman, Tom Wilson, and his son Jake handle most of the cattle work," Isaac explained. "Good men. They live in the bunkhouse by the corrals. The house is just for us. You'll have the bedroom at the top of the stairs. Mine's on the first floor." Eliza studied the property with growing amazement. The house was larger than she'd expected, weathered but well-maintained with a broad porch wrapping around 2 sides. It wasn't a grand home by Eastern standards, but on the frontier, it represented substantial comfort and security. As they approached, a lanky man emerged from the barn, raising his hand in greeting. Isaac returned the gesture before helping Eliza down from the wagon. "Tom, this is Miss Eliza Dawson." "She'll be keeping house from now on," Isaac said simply, as if acquiring household help from an auction block were a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Tom, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes, merely nodded. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Good to have a woman's touch around here again." Eliza nodded in return, grateful for his matter-of-fact acceptance. "I'll show you the house," Isaac said, carrying her new belongings and leading the way up the porch steps. The interior of the house surprised Eliza even more than its exterior. Though distinctly masculine and utilitarian, It was clean and well-ordered. The main floor contained a large kitchen with a cast iron cookstove, a dining area, a comfortable sitting room with bookshelves lining one wall, and Isaac's bedroom and study behind closed doors. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a small sitting area near a window overlooking the valley. "This will be your room," Isaac said, opening a door to reveal a simple but pleasant chamber containing a bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk, and a rocking chair by the window. "The washroom is at the end of the hall. There's a pump in the kitchen for water, and the bath is filled by heating water on the stove." He set her packages on the bed. "I usually eat breakfast at sunrise, midday meal around noon, and supper at dusk, but that can change with the seasons and work. Tom and Jake sometimes eat with us, sometimes at the bunkhouse." He paused awkwardly. "I don't expect fancy cooking, just honest food. If you need anything, just—" He stopped, realizing the implied instruction to ask might be difficult for someone who didn't speak. Eliza nodded her understanding, looking around the room that was now hers, a space larger and more private than any she'd occupied since her parents' home. "I'll let you settle in," Isaac said, moving toward the door. "Supper in 2 hours, but don't worry about cooking tonight. I've got stew simmering already." After he left, Eliza sat tentatively on the edge of the bed, running her hand across the soft quilt. The room smelled of pine and fresh air, with a faint hint of lavender from a small sachet hanging from the bedpost. She wondered what kind of woman had occupied this space before her, Isaac's mother, perhaps, or a sister. Certainly not a wife. The town gossip would have mentioned that. She unpacked her few possessions, arranging her new clothes in the chest of drawers. The poetry book she placed carefully on the bedside table, a treasure to be savored later. Finally, she removed from her pocket the only item she had kept through all her travels, a small daguerreotype of her parents, its case tarnished but the image still clear. Setting it beside the book, Eliza allowed herself a rare moment of hope. Perhaps here in this quiet house with this quiet man, she might find, if not happiness, then at least peace. Over the next several weeks, Eliza and Isaac established a routine that functioned smoothly despite, or perhaps because of, the minimal conversation between them. Eliza rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, usually hearty fare of biscuits, bacon, eggs, and strong coffee. Isaac would nod his thanks, sometimes commenting briefly on the day's work ahead before heading out to join Tom and Jake with the cattle. During the day, Eliza kept the house immaculate, tended to the vegetable garden behind the kitchen, and prepared meals. Occasionally, she would venture to the chicken coop to collect eggs or to the smokehouse to select meat for dinner. The physical labor was far less demanding than what she'd endured in previous positions, and the solitude suited her temperament. Isaac respected her silence, never pressing her to speak, and in turn she respected his privacy, maintaining a careful distance. Yet in the evening hours, when work was done, they often occupied the same space, Isaac reading by the fire while Eliza mended clothing or practiced her needlework. These quiet moments, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire or the turning of pages, gradually became comfortable rather than tense. It was during one such evening in late May, about a month after her arrival, that Eliza first heard Isaac play the fiddle. She had finished washing the supper dishes and entered the sitting room to find him removing the instrument from its case. He glanced up, seeming almost embarrassed. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Haven't played much lately, but it's a good night for music." Eliza gestured for him to continue, settling into her usual chair with her sewing basket. Isaac positioned the fiddle under his chin and began to play not the raucous dance tunes one might hear in a saloon, but haunting melodies that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the vast landscape surrounding them. The music filled the room, wrapping around Eliza like a physical presence. Without conscious thought, her needle stilled in her hand as she listened, transported by the unexpected beauty flowing from this taciturn man. When he finally lowered the instrument, the silence felt different, richer somehow, charged with something neither of them could name. "My father taught me," Isaac said quietly, carefully returning the fiddle to its case. "Said music speaks when words fail. Eliza nodded, understanding completely. In that moment, she felt more connected to Isaac Owens than she had to anyone since her parents' death. The following Sunday, Isaac surprised her by announcing they would attend church in Timber Creek. "Not that I'm particularly religious," he explained, "but it's expected occasionally. Good for business connections, too." Eliza donned her new Sunday dress, a simple blue calico that nevertheless represented the finest clothing she'd owned in years. She arranged her hair carefully, securing it with one of the ribbons Mrs. Parker had insisted upon adding to their purchases. When she descended the stairs, Isaac was waiting in the sitting room, dressed in a clean black suit that transformed him from rugged rancher to distinguished gentleman. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, appreciation, perhaps, or simple surprise at her transformation. "You look very nice, Miss Dawson," he said formally, then added more softly, "Blue suits you." The compliment, unexpected and sincere, brought a flush to Eliza's cheeks. She nodded her thanks, unable to meet his gaze directly. The journey to town passed mostly in silence, but it was a companionable quiet rather than an awkward one. As they approached Timber Creek, however, Eliza's anxiety mounted. The church would mean people curious, judgmental people who would wonder about her arrangement with Isaac. Worse, someone might recognize her from the auction block, reinforcing her status as property rather than person. Isaac seemed to sense her discomfort. "We won't stay long after the service," he promised as he helped her down from the wagon, just enough to be polite. The small white clapboard church was already filling with families when they arrived. Isaac guided Eliza with a light touch at her elbow, nodding greetings to various townspeople as they made their way to a pew near the back. Throughout the service, Eliza remained acutely aware of the glances cast in their direction, some curious, others speculative, a few openly disapproving. She kept her eyes fixed on the hymnal, even though she did not join in the singing. When the service ended, Isaac led her outside where, as he had predicted, several people approached him with business matters or simple greetings. Mrs. Parker from the general store made her way directly to Eliza. "Well, don't you clean up nice," she said, inspecting Eliza's appearance with evident satisfaction. "How are you finding life at Wild Timber?" Before Eliza could determine how to respond without speaking, Isaac appeared at her side. "Miss Dawson has been a tremendous help," he said smoothly. "My house hasn't been so well managed since my mother was alive." "And still not talking?" Mrs. Parker asked bluntly, addressing the question to Isaac as if Eliza were not present. "Miss Dawson communicates quite effectively in her own way," Isaac replied, his tone cooling noticeably. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a long ride ahead." As they walked away, Eliza felt a surge of gratitude for his intervention and defense of her silence. She had long ago learned that most people interpreted her quietness as stupidity, sullenness, or deliberate rudeness, never considering that words might simply be too painful or dangerous to release. On the journey home, Isaac broke their usual silence. "I should apologize for Mrs. Parker and the others. Small towns breed curiosity and people forget their manners." Eliza shook her head slightly, indicating no apology was necessary. "Still," Isaac continued, "I realize our arrangement must seem strange to outsiders. If anyone makes you uncomfortable or treats you disrespectfully, I hope you'll let me know, however you choose to communicate it." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Eliza. For 4 years, she had existed as an object to be used and discarded at will. Now, this man who barely knew her was offering protection and consideration without demanding anything in return, not even her voice. That evening, after they returned home and changed into everyday clothes, Eliza made a decision. While Isaac was in the barn checking on a new calf, she retrieved a slate and chalk from his study items she had noticed during her cleaning but never touched. At supper, she placed them beside her plate. When Isaac entered the kitchen, his eyes immediately fell on the slate. He sat down without comment, serving himself from the platter of roast chicken and vegetables Eliza had prepared. Only after taking a few bites did he speak. "Good idea," he said casually, as if they had discussed the matter. might make some things easier. Eliza picked up the chalk and carefully wrote on the slate, "Thank you for today." Isaac read the message and nodded. No need for thanks, it was the right thing to do. This small exchange marked a turning point in their relationship. While Eliza still did not speak aloud, she began to use the slate for necessary communications and occasionally for more personal expressions. Isaac, in turn, shared more about himself and the ranch, explaining his plans for expanding the herd or describing the challenges of the coming winter. As spring blossomed into summer, life at Wild Timber settled into a rhythm that brought unexpected contentment to them both. Isaac found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, no longer viewing it merely as shelter but as a home, warmed by Eliza's quiet presence. For her part, Eliza discovered a growing sense of security and purpose in her role at the ranch, taking pride in creating comfort for this man who asked so little yet offered so much. Neither of them acknowledged the subtle shifts occurring between them, the lingering glances, the way Isaac's hand would sometimes brush hers when accepting a cup of coffee, the special care Eliza took with his favorite meals. These changes remained unspoken, like so much else in their unconventional household. Then came the day in late July when everything changed. The morning had dawned hot and still, the air heavy with the promise of a storm. Isaac and his men were working the north pasture, repairing fences damaged during a recent cattle drive. Eliza had spent the morning preserving cherries from the small orchard behind the house, the kitchen sweltering despite the windows thrown open to catch any stray breeze. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and Eliza watched with growing concern as lightning flashed in the distance. The men should have returned for the midday meal hours ago. Something must have delayed them, perhaps the weather, perhaps trouble with the cattle. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, Eliza made a decision. She found Isaac's oilskin coat hanging by the door and put it on, then filled a large canteen with fresh water and packed some bread and cold meat in a sack. The north pasture was only a mile away. She could reach it before the worst of the storm hit. The rain intensified as she walked, quickly turning the dirt road to mud that sucked at her boots with each step. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder. By the time she reached the pasture, she was soaked despite the coat, and visibility had decreased to mere yards through the sheeting rain. A sudden flash illuminated the scene before her. Isaac on the ground, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, with Tom and Jake attempting to fashion a makeshift stretcher from fence posts and a blanket. Relief flooded through her at finding them, followed immediately by fear at Isaac's obvious injury. "Miss Dawson," Jake called out, spotting her first. "Thank God Boss took a bad fall when his horse spooked at the lightning. Broke his leg, I reckon, maybe worse." Isaac looked up, pain etched across his features. "Eliza, what in heaven's name are you doing out here?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and despite the circumstances, the sound of it in his voice sent a strange warmth through her chest. She rushed forward, kneeling beside him in the mud without hesitation. His face was alarmingly pale, his breathing labored. Beyond the obvious broken leg, she noted a gash on his forehead that was bleeding freely. "We need to get him back to the house," Tom said grimly. "Storm's getting worse and he needs a doctor." Working together in the driving rain, they managed to secure Isaac to the makeshift stretcher. The journey back to the house was agonizingly slow, with Tom and Jake carrying Isaac while Eliza walked alongside, occasionally supporting his head when the terrain grew particularly rough. By the time they reached the house, Isaac had lost consciousness, his skin clammy and cold despite the summer heat. They carried him into his bedroom, where Eliza immediately took charge, motioning for the men to remove his muddy clothes while she gathered clean linens and her sewing basket. "I'll ride for Doc Wilson," Jake offered, already heading for the door despite his own exhaustion. "It's 15 miles to town in this weather," Tom protested. "You'll kill yourself or the horse." Jake shook his head. "No choice, Boss needs a doctor." After he left, Eliza and Tom worked together to clean and assess Isaac's injuries. The leg was indeed broken, the bone visible through torn flesh just below the knee. The head wound looked worse than it was, bleeding profusely but not particularly deep. More concerning was his continued unconsciousness and the bluish tinge to his lips. "Internal bleeding, maybe," Tom muttered, his weathered face grave. "Seen it before in the war, not much we can do except keep him warm and wait for the doc." Eliza nodded, then gestured for Tom to help her straighten the broken leg as best they could before splinting it with strips of wood from a fruit crate. Next, she cleaned and stitched the head wound with neat, precise sutures that spoke of previous experience. Throughout their ministrations, Isaac remained disturbingly still, his breathing shallow and uneven. "You've done this before," Tom observed as Eliza applied a poultice to the leg wound. She nodded without looking up. Her father had been a physician, and she had often assisted him before his death. Those skills, like so many others, had been buried beneath the necessities of survival during her years of servitude. "I'll stay with him," Tom offered when they had done all they could. "You should rest." Eliza shook her head firmly, pointing to herself and then to Isaac, her meaning clear. She would maintain the vigil. Throughout the long night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the house, Eliza sat beside Isaac's bed, bathing his face with cool water when fever rose and adding blankets when chills racked his body. She spooned broth between his lips during brief moments of semi-consciousness and changed the poultice on his leg regularly to draw out infection. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the storm finally began to subside, Isaac's fever broke. His breathing deepened, and some color returned to his face. Eliza, exhausted beyond measure, allowed herself to slump forward in her chair, her head coming to rest on the edge of the bed near his hand. She must have dozed, for the next thing she knew, gentle fingers were stroking her hair. She looked up to find Isaac watching her, his eyes clear and alert despite the pain evident in their depths. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice rough with dehydration. The simple statement, laden with wonder and gratitude, broke something loose inside Eliza, a dam that had held back words for 4 long years of grief and fear and loneliness. "Yes," she said, the single syllable emerging as a hoarse whisper, unused vocal cords protesting their sudden employment. "I stayed." Isaac's eyes widened at the sound of her voice, but before he could respond, the bedroom door opened to admit Doc Wilson, followed by an exhausted Jake. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical examination, splinting, and instructions for care. The doctor confirmed what Eliza had already surmised: a compound fracture of the tibia that would require weeks of immobility to heal properly, along with a concussion and several cracked ribs. There appeared to be no internal bleeding, but Isaac would need careful monitoring for signs of infection. "He's lucky to be alive," Doc Wilson told Eliza privately as he prepared to leave. "Another few hours without treatment, and that leg might have killed him through blood poisoning. Your quick work probably saved his life and certainly saved his leg." When the doctor had gone and Tom and Jake had returned to their duties, promising to check in regularly, Eliza found herself alone with Isaac once more. He was resting comfortably now, the laudanum the doctor had administered dulling the worst of his pain. "You spoke," he said softly when she approached the bed to adjust his pillows. Eliza nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Not often," she managed, the words coming slowly, painfully. "Why?" he asked, not demanding but genuinely curious. She sat beside him, gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, the words emerged haltingly like water through a partially blocked stream. "After my parents died, the people who took me in, they didn't want to hear my grief. Then later other employers, some men, they thought a silent woman was convenient, easier to forget I was human." Isaac's expression darkened with understanding and anger on her behalf. "And now?" he asked gently. Eliza met his gaze directly for perhaps the first time since her arrival at Wild Timber. "You never demanded words," she said simply, "so now I can choose to give them." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with surprising tenderness. "I'm honored by your choice, Eliza." The days that followed established yet another new rhythm to their household. With Isaac confined to bed, the management of both house and ranch fell heavily on Eliza's shoulders. She coordinated with Tom and Jake regarding the cattle, handled correspondence with buyers, and still maintained her usual domestic duties while caring for Isaac's injuries. Though physically incapacitated, Isaac did what he could to assist, directing operations from his sick bed and teaching Eliza the bookkeeping system he used to track ranch finances. These lessons often extended into the evening hours, with Eliza sitting beside his bed, poring over ledgers while Isaac explained the intricacies of cattle prices and feed costs. During these sessions, Eliza began to speak more frequently, though her voice remained soft and her sentences brief. She revealed fragments of her past, her father's medical practice in Ohio, her mother's love of literature, the epidemic that had claimed them both within days of each other when Eliza was 16. "After they died, I had nowhere to go," she explained one evening as she changed the bandage on Isaac's leg. "My father's brother took me in, but his wife resented another mouth to feed. When I couldn't stop crying at night, she said I was ungrateful. Eventually, I stopped speaking altogether. It seemed safer. And then," Isaac prompted gently when she fell silent, "then they sold my contract to a merchant in St. Louis. He was kind enough, but his wife thought I was simple-minded because I wouldn't speak. After a year, they sold me to a hotel owner in Kansas City. Then a farmer in Nebraska, then a widow in Dakota Territory who needed help with her children." Each sentence emerged with effort, as if the words themselves carried physical weight. "And finally to Montana," Isaac concluded, filling in the blank she had left. Eliza nodded. "The widow remarried. Her new husband didn't want reminders of her first marriage. I was sold to a trader who brought me to Timber Creek." The matter-of-fact recitation of her successive displacements struck Isaac more powerfully than any emotional appeal could have. The resilience required to endure such treatment without surrendering to bitterness or despair seemed to him a form of quiet heroism. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately. "No one should be treated as property." Eliza looked up from her work, surprised. "But you bought me," she said, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Isaac shook his head. "I purchased a labor contract, not a person. There's a difference, though I'll admit the distinction gets blurry out here where the law is thin." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "That contract is fulfilled as far as I'm concerned. You've more than earned your freedom with these weeks of care alone. If you want to leave wild timber, I'll arrange transportation and provide funds to get you wherever you wish to go." The offer, made with evident sincerity, stunned Eliza into momentary speechlessness. Freedom, the word she had almost stopped allowing herself to contemplate, was suddenly being handed to her without conditions. "And if I want to stay?" she asked finally, the question barely audible. "Then you stay as a free woman with fair wages and the right to change your mind whenever you choose," Isaac replied promptly. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Home." Another word she had almost forgotten the meaning of. Eliza looked around the room that had become familiar over the past months at the bookshelves lined with volumes Isaac had encouraged her to read, at the fiddle case in the corner from which he had drawn such beautiful music, at the man himself watching her with patient understanding in his eyes. "I would like to stay," she said simply. Isaac's smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of pain that had marked it since his injury. "I'm glad," he replied, the two words carrying more emotion than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. By mid-August, Isaac was able to move from bed to chair with the aid of crutches the local carpenter had fashioned. His forced confinement had been difficult for a man accustomed to physical activity, but it had also created opportunities for connection that might otherwise have taken years to develop. During long afternoons when the heat made outdoor work impossible even for the able-bodied, Isaac taught Eliza to play chess on a carved wooden set that had belonged to his grandfather. In the evenings, she read aloud from his collection of books haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as her voice strengthened through use. One such evening, as summer's heat began to give way to autumn's crispness, Eliza was reading from the Odyssey when she noticed Isaac watching her with an intensity that made her voice falter. "Is something wrong?" she asked, marking her place with a finger. "No," he said quickly, then more honestly, "Yes, I've been thinking about something and I'm not sure how to say it without risking the peace we've found." Eliza closed the book, giving him her full attention. "Just say it plainly," she suggested, the months of comfortable companionship having built a foundation of trust between them. Isaac nodded, drawing a deep breath. "Before my injury, we were employer and employee, though perhaps friends as well. These past weeks have changed things, at least for me." He paused, then continued with evident determination. "I find myself caring for you as more than a friend or housekeeper, Eliza. I understand if you don't feel the same, and I promise nothing will change regarding your position here if that's the case." The declaration, delivered with characteristic directness, nevertheless left Eliza momentarily speechless. Not from reluctance to respond, but from the overwhelming realization that her own feelings, which she had carefully contained and rationalized, were reciprocated. "Isaac," she began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I care for you too, more than I thought possible after everything." The smile that spread across his face held such joy that Eliza felt answering warmth bloom in her chest. He extended his hand to her, and she moved from her chair to sit beside him on the small sofa. "I don't want to rush you," he said softly. "We have time to see where this leads." Eliza nodded, grateful for his understanding of her need for caution. "I've learned that words can be difficult," she said carefully, "but silence doesn't mean absence of feeling." "I know," Isaac replied, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Some things don't need words at all." When he leaned forward to kiss her, Eliza met him halfway, the gesture more eloquent than any declaration could have been. The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of quiet happiness neither had expected to find. As Isaac's strength returned and he began to resume limited duties around the ranch, their relationship deepened from tentative affection to something more profound. They moved slowly, both aware of the vulnerabilities they carried from their respective pasts, but the direction of their journey was clear to them both. By October, when the first snow dusted the mountain peaks surrounding Wild Timber, Isaac was walking with only a slight limp, though the doctor warned he would always feel changes in the weather in his healed bones. One crisp morning, he suggested a ride to show Eliza a special place on the property she hadn't yet seen. "Think you can still sit a horse with that leg?" She teased as they saddled their mounts, her voice now flowing more naturally after months of regular use, though she still spoke less than most people. "I managed cattle drives with worse," he replied with a grin, though he accepted her help mounting with good grace. They rode through golden aspen groves, their fallen leaves carpeting the ground in sunshine hues. Isaac led the way up a gentle slope to a plateau overlooking the entire valley. From this vantage point, Wild Timber spread below them in panoramic splendor, the house and outbuildings nestled beside the creek, pastures stretching toward distant mountains, cattle grazing peacefully in the autumn sun. "My father brought me here when we first arrived," Isaac said as they dismounted. "I was 12, angry about leaving our home in Pennsylvania after my mother died. He showed me this view and said, 'This is ours now, son, not just to own, but to care for.' I didn't understand then what he meant." "And now," Eliza asked, standing beside him as they gazed across the landscape, "now I know he was talking about stewardship, not ownership. This land gives us life, but only if we respect it." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I've brought you here for a reason, Eliza." The seriousness in his tone made her heart quicken. "What reason?" "To ask if you'll marry me," he said simply. "Not because of any contract or obligation, but because I love you and want to build a life with you here as partners, as equals." Though she had begun to hope for such a proposal, the reality of it still overwhelmed Eliza. For a moment she couldn't find words, falling back on the silence that had been her refuge for so long. Isaac waited patiently, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to answer now," he said finally. And you don't have to speak if the words are difficult. I'll understand either way. His consideration, as always, gave her the courage to push through the tightness in her throat. Yes, she said clearly, the single word carrying all the certainty she felt. I love you, Isaac. I want to be your wife. Joy blazed across his face as he gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite his still healing leg. When he set her down, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for when I found someone worth building a life with. Eliza looked down at the ring, then back to Isaac's face. I never thought I'd find home again after my parents died, she said softly. But that's what you've given me, Isaac, not just shelter, but belonging. We've given it to each other, he corrected gently. You brought life back to wild timber, Eliza. You made it a home again, not just for me, but for yourself too. As they rode back to the house, plans for their future flowing between them, Eliza reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From the auction block where her silence had been considered a defect to this sunlit valley, where it was accepted as simply part of who she was, the distance seemed immeasurable in more than just miles. The wedding took place in late November, a small ceremony in the Timber Creek Church with only a few witnesses, Tom and Jake, Doc Wilson and his wife, Mrs. Parker from the general store, and a handful of neighboring ranchers with whom Isaac did business. Eliza wore a new dress of deep blue wool, and Isaac stood tall and proud in his best suit, only the slightest unevenness in his stance betraying his healed injury. When the minister asked if she took Isaac as her lawfully wedded husband, Eliza's "I do" rang clear and confident through the small church. The words that had once been so difficult came easily now, carrying the weight of her commitment and love. The town's reaction to their marriage was mixed. Some approved of the respectability it brought to what had been considered a scandalous arrangement, while others gossiped about the strange, quiet woman who had somehow captured the reclusive rancher's heart. Neither Isaac nor Eliza paid much attention to the talk, too focused on their shared life to concern themselves with others' opinions. Their first winter as husband and wife passed in contented industry, long evenings by the fire where Isaac played his fiddle while Eliza sewed or read aloud. Mornings working side by side to care for the animals and maintain the house against winter's assault. Nights discovering each other with increasing intimacy and trust. By spring, when the first wildflowers appeared on the hillsides, Eliza had news to share. They were in the garden behind the house, preparing the soil for planting, when she straightened from her work and placed a hand on her still flat stomach. Isaac, she said quietly, I think we'll need to prepare the second bedroom upstairs for a nursery. He looked up sharply, his eyes widening as her meaning registered. A baby, you're sure? When she nodded, his face transformed with wonder and joy. He crossed to her in 2 long strides, gathering her gently in his arms. A child, he murmured against her hair. Our child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, with Eliza remaining active in household duties even as her body changed to accommodate the new life within. Isaac hovered protectively, ensuring she rested adequately and ate well, while Tom and Jake took on additional responsibilities to lighten her workload. As her due date approached in late autumn, Isaac insisted on bringing a midwife to stay at Wild Timber, an older woman named Martha from a neighboring ranch who had delivered most of the children in the area over the past 30 years. First babies often take their time, Martha reassured them as October turned to November and Eliza grew increasingly uncomfortable. The little one will come when ready, not before. The prediction proved accurate. Their daughter, Lily Grace Owens, arrived during the first snowfall of winter, her birth coinciding almost exactly with their first wedding anniversary. She had Isaac's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair like Eliza's, and from her first breath, she seemed to possess the quiet watchfulness that characterized both her parents. She's perfect, Isaac whispered as he held his daughter for the first time, awe evident in every line of his face. Just like her mother, Eliza, exhausted but radiant, reached up to touch his cheek. "She'll have your stubborn streak, I suspect." The joke, a rare display of humor from Eliza, made Isaac laugh aloud, the sound of pure happiness filling the room. "With both of us for parents, she'll certainly know her own mind." As winter settled over Wild Timber, the small family established new routines centered around Lily's needs. Isaac proved to be a devoted father, as comfortable rocking his daughter to sleep as he was managing ranch hands or negotiating cattle sales. Eliza, whose own family had been torn from her so abruptly, poured all her love and protection into this new life they had created together. On Christmas Eve, with Lily sleeping peacefully in the cradle Isaac had crafted for her, they sat before the fire in the sitting room, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "I have something for you," Isaac said, retrieving a small package from behind a book on the shelf. "An early Christmas gift." Eliza unwrapped it carefully to reveal a journal bound in soft leather, its pages blank and waiting. Embossed on the cover was a single word: voice. "I thought," Isaac explained hesitantly, "that you might want to write your story for Lily someday, or just for yourself. The parts you can speak and the parts you can't, all of it matters." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Eliza's eyes. In it, she recognized not just acceptance of her periodic silences, but affirmation that her experiences, even the painful ones, had value and deserved to be preserved. "Thank you," she said, running her fingers over the embossed letters, "for understanding." "I love all of you, Eliza," Isaac replied simply, "the words and the silence both." She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly into the hollow of his shoulder as they watched the dancing flames. Outside, snow fell silently over Wild Timber, blanketing the land in pristine white nature's own moment of quiet beauty in a vast and sometimes harsh world. In the cradle nearby, Lily stirred and made a small sound. Immediately, both parents turned toward their daughter, attuned to her needs with the instinctive awareness of deep love. As Eliza lifted the baby to her breast, Isaac wrapped an arm around them both, creating a circle of warmth and protection against the winter night. In that moment, Eliza realized that the journey from the auction block to this hearth had given her more than just physical freedom or material security. It had restored her voice, not just the ability to speak when necessary, but the deeper voice of self that expresses itself in choices made, in love given and received, in a life lived with intention and hope. Isaac had once told her that silence wasn't a problem if she stayed. What neither of them had fully understood then was that in staying and choosing each other despite their wounds and fears, they would create something that transcended both words and silence. A home where each could be fully themselves, heard and valued in all the ways that truly mattered. As winter deepened outside and warmth enveloped them within, Eliza looked at her husband and daughter and finally spoke the complete truth that had been growing in her heart since that first day when Isaac had defended her right to silence. "I stayed because you saw me," she said softly. "Not just what I could do or be for you, but who I was beneath the silence. That's why I found my voice again, because you heard me even when I couldn't speak." Isaac's eyes, bright with unshed tears, met hers. "And I'll keep listening," he promised, "for all the days of our lives." It was a promise he would keep through all the seasons that followed through the birth of their son 2 years later, through droughts and blizzards that threatened the ranch, through the gradual growth of Wild Timber into one of the most prosperous properties in the territory. Through it all, Isaac and Eliza built their partnership on that foundation of deep listening and respect, teaching their children by example that true communication often happens in the spaces between words. As the years passed and their children grew, Eliza gradually filled the journal Isaac had given her, recording not just her own story but the ongoing narrative of their family. She wrote of cattle drives and Christmas mornings, of first steps and first days of school, of the quiet moments that defined their life together as surely as any dramatic event. And sometimes, when words failed her, as they still occasionally did during times of strong emotion, Isaac would simply hold her hand or play his fiddle, the music speaking what neither of them needed to say aloud. For they had learned together the most important lesson of all, that love expresses itself in countless ways, and the heart recognizes truth whether it arrives in eloquent speeches or in comfortable silence. 20 years after that fateful day at the auction block, Eliza stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Isaac taught their grandson to ride his first pony in the yard. Her hair now showed threads of silver, and the years of frontier life had etched fine lines around her eyes, but the quiet strength that had sustained her through hardship remained undiminished. As Isaac looked up and caught her eye, smiling the same warm smile that had first given her hope for a different kind of life, Eliza felt the familiar surge of gratitude that never diminished with time. From across the yard, without words, his expression said what he had demonstrated every day of their life together: that her silence had never been a flaw to be fixed, but simply one facet of the woman he loved completely. In a world that often demanded noise and performance, they had created a haven where silence could be as eloquent as speech, where listening mattered more than talking, where presence itself was the most profound communication of all. And in that truth, Eliza had found not just her voice, but her home,